In 1993, director Steven Spielberg and star Liam Neeson gave the world a haunting depiction of one of humanity's greatest tragedies.
In 2021, we double up on Speyside single malts.
The film is Schindler's List.
The whiskey is Aberlour 16 and 18.
And we'll review them both. This is
The Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 1993 Best Picture winner, Schindler's List. Brad, this is one of those movies that I feel like we almost need to have a disclaimer up front at the beginning of this episode, because this movie is so revered and the material is so heavy and so weighty. We are looking at potentially, humanity's bleakest moment here, talking about the Holocaust. And I think that sometimes people tend to talk about this movie in such a way that you kind of have to keep it at arm's length, that you don't, talk about any problems the movie might have, that you also don't acknowledge the fact that this movie has humor in it at many points. And I just want to say up front that we are doing this in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is this week. This is an important movie to talk about. This might be one of the most important films ever made, just in terms of documenting what we went through as a people in, the 1940s and through the Holocaust. But at the same time, we're still going to be who we are. We're going to talk about this movie from a filmmaking point of view, and we're not going to come into it with a kind of dour, downcast tone. Just because this movie deserves our praise and our recognition doesn't mean we have to be completely solemn about how we talk about it.
Yeah, I think that anybody who watches this film will recognize it's a phenomenal film. The cinematography is great. The soundtrack by John Williams is great. There's a lot that's wonderful going on here. But at the end of the day, it's still a movie. It still has flaws. There's still things going on here that, might not be perfect for us. But I will say just up front, Bob, this is a phenomenal movie. And even any flaws we find aside, I would probably put it in the top 10 of all the movies we've had on this podcast so far.
Yeah. And obviously, I don't think anyone is going to come in here and give scorching hot takes about Schindler's List as a bad movie. You know what I mean?
You mean we're not going to do hot takes? No, find one-star reviews?
Absolutely. I feel like that will go downhill very, very quickly. So with that said, Brad, it's really good to see you today. And I say that because for the first time in over a year, we are recording the Film and Whiskey Podcast in person. I'm sitting 3 feet from you. We are staring at each other longingly.
6 feet, Bob.
I'm vaccinated, bro. 3 feet now.
Dude, I am so excited for this because, I mean, we started this podcast in 2018, I think?
2019. Early 2019.
Early 2019. Yeah, I feel like we started... When did we start going remote? I think it was around the end of 2019.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So it's been a hot minute since we've been together. I believe the last time we did that was the revered film Asmodeus, I believe is what it's called.
Yeah, Amadeus was the last time Brad and I recorded in person. I think I remember us sitting out in your backyard to record that, which now in retrospect was a very poor idea for the audio.
I think it was one of the greatest ideas ever, especially when you get the nice, white suburban lawn mowing dad out there. It was great, man. Having
to work around neighbors' lawnmowers is how God intended podcasts to be recorded.
That's right.
Well, Brad, it's good to see you in person, man. And, we are talking about a movie today that is very heavy. But in some ways, I feel like we have kind of given ourselves a precursor to this movie. Obviously, Schindler's List, directed by Steven Spielberg. In many ways, this is kind of his crowning achievement. This was the movie that I think finally made critics of his view him as a quote-unquote real filmmaker. All the way through the 1970s and the 1980s, people viewed him as this guy who just made popcorn movies or cheesy, Frank Capra kind of movies. And he comes out with this movie and it's in black and white and most of it is shot handheld. It's almost documentary style. It is absolutely brutal in the way that it depicts violence. And people really turned on a dime in terms of saying, okay, this guy Spielberg is a real filmmaker. And I think that we have had kind of a precursor to this when we talked about Saving Private Ryan last season, because in many ways I can see not just the filmmaking techniques that both of these movies share, but you can really tell that these are both really close to the heart kind of projects for Spielberg.
Yeah, and the wild thing is, when you look at Spielberg as a director, 1993 was kind of a big year for him, because not only did he have Schindler's List come out, but he also had Jurassic Park come out, which is, just a little bit different of a movie.
Just a bit.
just a little bit.
Yeah, this is one of the best 1-2 punches in history. And Spielberg himself has had a couple years like this where he's done 2 films in 1 year. I think the year that he did War of the Worlds, he also did Munich. And it was kind of a similar, like a popcorn movie and a very heavy movie. And I just can't believe that he was able to have both of these movies in production at the same time. Like, there were times where he's working on Schindler's List, and on the weekends he would go to like the nearest big city and watch the dailies that were coming in from the B team that was filming stuff for Jurassic Park.
That's absolutely wild to me, to have all of that in your brain at once, and to have like the style that he was looking for on Jurassic Park versus what he was looking for on Schindler's List. That alone speaks to the quality of a director that he really is.
Yeah, for sure. And Brad, before we get any further, I think we do need to move into Brad Explains. This is the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the plot of the movie that he has just seen, often for the first time. Brad, I have a feeling that this was not your first time seeing Schindler's List. Is that the case?
Yeah, I've watched it once before. I can't remember exactly when it was. I think it was late high school. I don't remember watching it at high school, but I believe it was sometime when I was 17, 18, 19, maybe early college. But I know that I've seen it before. It had been a little while, and for a reason. This is a really... Honestly, Bob, this is one of the heaviest movies I think anyone will ever watch.
Oh, for sure. Especially like mainstream movies. I'm sure there's other films out there. There's a movie that's about World War II that's called Come and See. It's a European movie, and people that watch that are like, I was scarred for life after I saw that movie. But for most of us who just go to your town's multiplex, for this movie to come out on such a big scale with such an A-list production behind it, you're absolutely right, Brad. This is it's a harrowing movie. I think that's the best word to use for it. And so as we move into Brad Explains, as you know, Brad, we have a 60-second limit on Schindler's List. I honestly don't think it will take very long to explain the plot of this movie. But Brad, can you explain to our listeners the plot of Schindler's List?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying this. The majority of the movie feels and looks like a documentary showing what happened in the Holocaust. So I'm honestly not going to talk about that at all, because in the end, I think we all have enough of a history. And if you don't, watch Schindler's List. You'll see what happened. But beyond that, I think the movie really centers around the character of Oskar Schindler. He is a German businessman who is using slave-like wages of Jews in order to make a profit, and make a profit he does. He makes millions and millions of dollars in modern terms off of this slave labor and selling pots and pans to the German army. However, the movie centers on his slow turn towards morality, towards believing in the dignity of human life. And it focuses on how, at the end of the movie, he is able to save a little over 1,000 Jews from the furnaces of Auschwitz. And he painstakingly takes care for his workers, who he has come to love in that time.
Yeah, absolutely, Brad. This movie tracks one person's journey from, essentially from being a very selfish person to a person who is acting completely selflessly. And as we get into talking about the movie, Brad, I think I want to start with talking about some of the filmmaking techniques that you see in this movie. Much like Saving Private Ryan, a lot of this movie is shot with handheld cameras. It's shot in black and white. So like Brad said, it gives this kind of air of authenticity. It looks like the newsreels that you would see coming home from World War II dispatches overseas. And it really gives the movie a sense of authenticity. It doesn't have that sort of that glossy Hollywood look to it, which would really ring false with circumstances like this that's being portrayed. But one of the things that I loved watching this movie again is watching Spielberg pull out all of the stops of his own sort of filmmaking encyclopedia that he has in his mind. So like the very first thing you see in the movie is a Seder dinner being said and candles being lit, and the candle wicks are in color. right? Everything's in color, and then all of a sudden it kind of drains to black and white. And the light in the candle, the flame goes out, and its smoke comes up, and there's a match cut. It's called a match cut when you cut from one scene to another, and something is like in the exact same place on the screen. It cuts from the smoke coming up out of this Seder dinner candle to the smoke coming up out of a train, smokestack, carrying Jews off to the ghetto, basically. It doesn't draw a lot of attention to itself, but it's just another one of these touches that Spielberg does where if you're looking for it, you're like, oh, Spielberg is doing what Kubrick did in 2001 when, the ape threw the bone in the air and it cut to the spaceship. Like, that's the most famous match cut in history. I love that in this movie, he is very restrained in kind of showing his filmmaking prowess. But when he wants to do it, or when it's necessary to kind of move the story along, he still has those kind of flashes there too.
Yeah, he has this ability in the film to just draw the viewer in to the most minute of details. And yet at the same time, he paints this broad picture of death, destruction, depravity through the lens of Schindler. And you kind of get this sense that, I don't know, I feel like compared to a lot of his other movies, this movie is so much less smooth than his other films. Like, I think about Jurassic Park, it's an easy comparison because it came out in the same year. But like, I think about Jurassic Park, I don't know if there's a single like handheld shot in that movie. Everything is off of a dolly. Everything is smooth. Everything is built to show the majesty of these dinosaurs. Whereas in Schindler's List, everything is meant to show the tenuous, string of life that most Jews were living on throughout the Holocaust. And I think that that's one of the most beautiful things. For me, one of my favorite shots in the movie is when Liam Neeson, Schindler, is comforting Helen, the maid. Mm-hmm. And the camera is slowly zooming in on Helen, and it's shaking just a tiny bit. It's not quite the shaky cam you have in other parts of the movie, but it's just barely moving a little bit as she's almost like sobbing and trying to talk to Schindler. And then it cuts just to the left a little bit, and it shows and it focuses on Schindler, and the camera is rock steady solid. And it's little pieces like that he gets to show the shakiness that all Jews are living with us at this time. And you see Schindler as this rock. You see him as this steadying force that is able to care for the Jews when they are so uncertain about their future. And it's just little things like that he does with the cinematography that he's just working, honestly, above what he had shown to be his class up until this point.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I do think that he brings to bear on this movie a lot of his kind of Hollywood movie magic mindset as well, though, in that he knows how to pace this movie really well. Like, it's a long movie. And I do think that there are elements of this movie that probably could have been trimmed down, but I don't think that's because Spielberg is being too indulgent. And like, we'll talk about the script in a little bit, but I really notice it this time around where he knows exactly where there needs to be a little bit of humor and a little bit of lightness, and when the movie really needs to get moving. There's this really great scene earlier in the movie where, Schindler is a womanizer. He's cheating on his wife a bunch, and his wife basically catches him in bed with another woman and says, I want you to promise me that no one's ever going to mistake me for one of your mistresses, and I'll stay here. And you don't even see Schindler's reaction. It cuts right to her hanging out of a train window and him being like, well, see you later, dear. Like, and it pulls
I love
away.
You.
Yeah.
I will say that was one of the funniest parts of the movie, and it is hard to talk about a movie being funny that it's about the Holocaust, but there is a few humorous moments in the film. I'm curious though, that there's like maybe 2 or 3 moments in the film that I just felt like didn't jive with the rest of the movie, that being one of them. Mm-hmm. So you seem to be viewing it in a positive light. I really don't know how I feel about it, because when you get down to it, like, I know that they're trying to show that he's a womanizer and not a very high morals person, right? But there is a part of me that moment is so funny. I just don't know how I feel like it fits with the rest of the film. Did that bother you at all?
So I think it's one of these, classic Hollywood lessons that you see in movies from people like Ernst Lubitsch or Billy Wilder, where if you want to make them cry, you first need to be able to make them laugh. And I think that you need something in this movie to kind of break up the tension a little bit, to get people on board, to show that Schindler isn't a saint. And I think that's really important, that they don't portray him in this like almost godly manner, that he's a cheat and a crook and a womanizer who very slowly has his heart changed. And so I think those moments are really necessary, not just from like a character development point of view, but also just to make sure the audience gets on board. I think a good comparison to this movie in some ways is the movie 12 Years a Slave, which, won the Best Picture Oscar. And I never really connected with that movie. And I think part of it is because it insisted, the filmmaking of that movie is very similar to this. There's a lot of handheld, really horrifying scenes of what happened in the Deep South during slavery. But I think that movie really seemed to like insist that you cannot enjoy the filmmaking of this movie at any point. You have to be constantly in the mindset of what you are seeing is horrifying. And I think that with Schindler's List, whether for good, I could see how people might not like that element of it, that you are on board with the filmmaking of the movie. You are on board with the characters of the movie. And because of that, when the movie does finally delve into like the depths of humanity, the darkness that's there, you don't want to tear your eyes away from it. You don't want to just turn it off and be like, that's too heavy for me. It's not like one of those commercials that comes on TV where you're just confronted with images of starving children all of a sudden. By getting the viewer on board early on, I think it allows Spielberg to take you where he needs it to go.
I think another element of it that I'm realizing that I really like is that, I haven't seen 12 Years a Slave, so I'm just going to take, what you just said as gospel. But when you have a movie like Schindler's List, I think that it's too easy for us to caricaturize the entire Holocaust as like there was just nothing happy or good or positive or anything going on at the time. It was all evil, all bad, all down, all dour. Like even in the middle of intense suffering, there are moments of happiness. That's why I love the scene where you see the people getting married in the middle of their barracks, right? That Spielberg is willing to show the fact that there are evil people having a good time in the midst of this, but at the same time, there are good people having a good time in the midst of this. And that real life is never easily boiled down to just, oh, that is all evil, or no, that is all good. Like even in the midst of the Holocaust, there's good things happening. There's obviously many terrible things happening. But I don't know, maybe I'm coming around on it a little bit that, there's some stuff going on that you can kind of make fun of in the midst of that.
Well, and I think that there's one thing you have to keep in mind with this too, is that Spielberg is not going into this intending to tell the definitive story of the Holocaust. Like you're not in back rooms with Nazi officials who are planning this whole thing. You're not seeing, the concentration camps get built from the ground up. That's not his intention here. And the way he wants to talk about the Holocaust is by talking about the story of this guy, Oskar Schindler. And Spielberg was really influenced by a documentary that came out in the mid 80s called Shoah, which was really the first one that dove deeply into the Holocaust. I think it's like an 8-hour long documentary, and I've never watched it. I've heard it's absolutely harrowing to watch, and it really kind of prompted Spielberg, if you listen to him tell stories about it, to really kind of own his Jewish heritage in a way that he had been kind of neglecting and pushing off for a long time. And he decided that he wanted to make his sort of Holocaust movie. And this book had come out called Schindler's Ark by Thomas Keneally. And I say all that just to say the way that Spielberg wants to discuss the Holocaust is by examining the real life story of one person. And you see things pretty much through his eyes, although I think the camera's pretty objective in this movie. But things happen to Oskar Schindler the way they would happen to any of us. Like you don't see Hitler give orders to liquidate Jews. You just happen to see Oskar Schindler stumble upon the liquidation of the ghettos and watch this little girl in a red coat walking down the street. And so by seeing the things that we all know happen unfold in the real life of this person, you have to tell a narrative that way. And so I think that's kind of where I make the distinction of like, yes, this movie can have moments of humor. Yes, this movie can have things that happen outside of just plot, 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 plot. Let's talk about how we're going to save these Jews. You know what I mean? And so if you want a documentary about the Holocaust, there are movies that do that. That wasn't the intention of this movie.
Well, and I will say, I think that that's where this movie struggles just a little bit, is the way that it moves back and forth between documentary mode and drama mode, right? Because this really is a drama about the life of Oskar Schindler, about his interactions with this corrupt German officer, Amon Goeth, and played by Ralph Fiennes, who can actually carry a German accent the whole time, unlike Liam Neeson. But that aside, I think that one of the key things of this movie is that it is part documentary, part drama. And one of the few struggles that I really think this movie is detracted by is the fact that certain parts of the movie, you're utterly drawn in by Schindler's life and what he's doing and his efforts. And then it's almost like they flip a switch and, okay, we're back in documentary mode. And sometimes that transition is done very well, but other times I feel like it's just an abrupt jarring, like, oh, sorry, we're back into seeing the plight and devastation of the Jews now, and we're not even going to worry about Schindler for 10, 15 minutes at a time.
Yeah. And I think that going along with that, Brad, my big issue with the way this movie is structured, it really does come down to some glaring issues that I see in the script. And that's because after a certain point, the movie really does start to take that turn into, all right, stuff's getting real now. Like once the ghettos get liquidated, once they pull that man that has one arm out of the factory assembly line and shoot him in the head, that's the first real glimpse you see of like what Amon Goeth is up to and how he operates. And once they kind of take that turn, we need to see less and less of life outside the camps. Because, you know, for a while, it's like intercutting between how Oskar Schindler wheels and deals and the real life impact that these kind of decisions have on the Jewish people. And, you know, and it has a really good effect because then you cut back to Schindler again and you're starting to see these people die. You cut back to Schindler and realize it's still not touching or affecting his life at all. And I think it makes a really good point in the first half of the movie. But where I started to get annoyed with it was once his workers start getting sent to camps, once they get mixed up and sent to Auschwitz, the plight of those people is, again, I'm going to use that word, it's harrowing. It's difficult to watch, but it is something that I feel like needs to be seen. And then we continue to cut back to what Schindler is doing now with a kind of changed heart to get them out of that situation. And I just feel like those, you know, kind of backroom deals that he's making don't have the dramatic weight to match up with what they're being intercut with. Like you're cutting back to watching people get literally like burned in a furnace or gassed to death. And then you cut back to Schindler kind of bribing people with diamonds. And it's like, well, I appreciate seeing how he got this deal done, but I don't know if I needed that every 10 minutes to keep going back to Schindler and seeing that. It just didn't work for me.
I'm not totally sure if I'm there with you, Bob. I think by the end of the film, it felt like those scenes were much faster than they were earlier in the movie. And so it felt like they kind of got through that a little bit quicker to just say, hey, like Schindler's working on your behalf. He's trying to wheel and deal, not for himself anymore, but for you, his workers, the Jewish folk that he's trying to save. And so it didn't bother me a ton that they switched back and forth. Like I said, for me, it just came down to the fact that throughout the movie, it just feels like they keep flipping the switch back and forth between Schindler's drama and Holocaust documentary. And like I said, that's not a bad thing. I think it makes Schindler's drama more effective, but it just gets a little bit tiresome after a while. It gets a little bit... I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but it just gets to be a little bit much where I'm like, okay, let's just stick with one thing or the other, or find a way to transition between the two a little bit better.
Yeah, Brad. And I mean, I'm there with you. And I think like you said, my gripe with the movie is probably a little bit more specific than what yours was. But before we kind of get down a rabbit trail of criticizing this movie too much, I do want to talk about the three main actors in this movie, all of whom are men. You know, the first being Liam Neeson as Oskar Schindler, the second being Ralph Fiennes as Amon Goeth, and the third one being Ben Kingsley as Itzhak Stern. And I guess let's just start at the top, Brad. You know, this movie is called Schindler's List. Liam Neeson, an Irishman, is playing this German businessman. I don't know how I feel about Liam Neeson. I think he's really good in this movie, and I think it's probably his best acting performance that I've ever seen him, you know, do. However, I can't tell sometimes if it's the fault of the script for making him be so stoic through most of the movie, or if it's just kind of the fact that Liam Neeson doesn't have a lot of range as an actor, that he doesn't really show the complex emotions that he's feeling. You get that great I mean, absolutely devastating final scene where he finally breaks down. He can't hold it in any longer, and he just collapses in Stern's arms, sobbing. And I think Neeson really nails that scene.
I could have got more. I don't know if I just... I could have got more.
Oscar, there are 1,100 people who are alive because of you. Look at them.
If I'd made more money. I threw away so much money. You have no idea. If I just...
There will be generations because of what you did.
I didn't do enough.
You did so much.
But for me, for most of the movie, I was like, all right, I can't get a good read on this guy. I know what they're trying to tell me is happening internally, but I just don't know if Neeson is capable of pulling off those really minute details in his expressions.
See, I'm actually almost in a complete opposite spot where I really enjoyed Neeson throughout the movie. And the final scene, I don't know if this is Neeson's fault, but the final scene for me felt like it was from a different movie. And I don't want to complain about it because I wept. I mean, I absolutely sobbed through that final scene. And so it's not like I didn't like that scene or think it was effective, but it just felt like such a big departure from what Spielberg had been doing for the rest of the film. That for most of the movie, even the dramatic elements with Goethe and Schindler and Stern, that like you see the seriousness of the entire movie, that at the end of the film, it felt like Neeson was suddenly going huge, right? That he suddenly was just going big, trying to hit a grand slam. And I don't know, it felt so different from the rest of the movie. And obviously maybe that was the point, to say, hey, like the weight of this burden, he has had to act. The character of Oskar Schindler has had to act and wheel and deal and do all of these things to save these people, that finally, when the weight is off of him, he breaks. And so I appreciate what they were doing. I just think I struggled a little bit with that final scene because it was just so much different than the rest of the movie. Honestly, the big problem for me with Neeson, my dude, like, don't even try to do a German accent if you can't do it.
Yeah.
Like, he literally tries to on and off throughout the film, but he can't do a German accent. And the biggest problem with his lack of a German accent is the spectacular nature in which Ralph Fiennes plays Amon Goeth and can just flawlessly pull off a German way of speaking.
Well, so I don't know if I would say that it's perfect. I think that it's definitely like an exaggerated German accent. But
it's a heck of a lot better than what Neeson was trying to do.
You're right. It's consistent. He never comes out of it. And I think that's the thing that you're right, Brad. Just going back to that final scene, I do think that, like you said, it was intentional that Spielberg set it up the way he did. Because I think that, you know, when you sit down with that script and you say, like, if I want one scene to really have the sort of emotional, almost sentimental impact that it needs, then I have to tell the rest of the movie. Like, I have to play the rest of the movie very straight and very documentary-like. Or else you're going to have too many scenes of, you know, your actors going way too big, like just going into histrionics, and it's not going to land. And I think that for him to just say, like, no, it's going to be this one scene, he's going to go very big, and because it's the only scene in the movie where that happens, it's going to work a lot better.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that you just said. Like, it makes sense to me that they did it. I just remember I got done with the movie and I was reflecting and trying to think about, you know, my thoughts on the film. And I just remember thinking, you know, I don't know how I felt about that final scene. And it, like I said, doesn't mean I don't like it. It just felt different than the rest of the movie. And so it I don't know. I'm sure I'll watch it again someday and it won't even occur to me.
Yeah, I get that. All right, so real quick, let's talk about Ralph Fiennes. Let's talk about Ben Kingsley. Let's go Ralph Fiennes first. Brad, aside from his good accent, what did you think of him in this movie?
Well, I think that he really embodied kind of the chaos that the Third Reich has come to represent, that they were just this wild bunch of power-hungry men who cared only for their own advancement. And he's a loose cannon through and through. And I think that you see in him the strange nature in which Germany dealt with what they, termed to be the Jewish problem. That they were slightly obsessed with the Jews, that they had this weird fascination with them, and that it led to a fearful, assaulting destruction of an entire people group. And you kind of see that with his relationship with his maid, Helen. And so I just think Ralph Fiennes knocks it out of the freaking park, man. Yeah, I don't know. Where are you with his performance?
I agree. And I think that there are times when the script, I feel weirdly about it because I feel like sometimes the script paints him too broadly, like he's just too evil. But then I also think that sometimes showing the kind of internal struggle that he has to try to be good, that also doesn't come across as authentic to me sometimes. And I think that Ralph Fiennes is fantastic in trying to portray that. And from all accounts, this is actually what Amon Gert was like. He was this kind of, not to use the word, but kind of bipolar in that way. Like he would flip a switch and it would be completely different. And I struggle sometimes to separate his fantastic performance from what I see as like maybe some flaws with the script.
Yeah, I don't know, man. For me, I think that you really see that struggle with like, man, am I going to pardon these people? And eventually the answer is it's not as much fun. Like that's what it comes down to, because you see the way in which, the scene is that Liam and him are drunk one night and Amon Gert is like, well, I have true power. I can kill anyone. And Schindler says, well, true power isn't to kill someone you have at your mercy. It's to know that somebody did something wrong and pardon them. And so they have a few scenes of him going around and pardoning people for what they did wrong. And eventually you can feel it in the way that in the way that Ralph Fiennes portrays it. You can feel this sense of boredom and dissatisfaction.
Yep.
That in the end, maybe it is more power to pardon someone. I don't care. I just want to have fun. I just want to shoot people with my gun. And that's really what it comes down to. And I think Fiennes does such a spectacular job with that.
All right, Brad, that leaves us with Ben Kingsley as Itzhak Stern to talk about. And I think if there is kind of an unsung hero of this movie, not just in terms of actually being a heroic person, but in terms of the acting that's being done, it's definitely Kingsley. He has the most sort of muted, subdued performance of everybody. And yet I really feel like he's laying the groundwork to really support these other two kind of larger than life characters around him. I don't know. Did he stand out to you in any way?
Oh, 100%. I think the restrained nature in which he just allowed things to come to him really stood as a representation of the Jewish people as a whole. That they stood through that trial unbending, unbowed, but not necessarily forcing their own perspective or way of life on other people. They were content to live their own life, to interact with others on a limited basis. And I think that Stern really represents that so beautifully. But you see that quiet strength that undergirds everything he does. And so for me, I think Kingsley came across beautifully in this film and really makes Stern one of the most compelling characters in the movie.
All right, Brad, it sounds like we're off to a good start on this one. I do want to talk a little bit more about our analysis of the movie, what it's done for Holocaust research and awareness throughout the world. We'll get into talking about that after the break. But for now, we have two whiskeys to try, both from the Aberlour distillery in Scotland. So what do you say we drink some single malt scotch?
Let's get to it.
All right, so today we are trying two whiskeys from the Aberlour distillery, which comes from the Speyside region of Scotland. Brad, we are drinking single malt Scotch whiskey. Can you remind our listeners, because it's been a while, I think we started this season with 5 or 6 straight bourbons. This is our first Scotch this year. What does it mean when a Scotch says single malt on the label?
Yeah, Bob. So single malt is actually indicating two different things. Single is indicating that this is a product of one distillery. You know, in the bourbon world, this isn't like completely unheard of, right? Like most distilleries just make their own whiskey. You do have places like Bardstown Bourbon Company that are, you know, mixing and going crazy and making some of the most beautiful stuff out there. But in the Scotch world, they're actually known for a lot of different really beautiful blended Scotch whiskeys. So by calling it single, they're indicating, hey, this comes from one distillery. It's not a blend of anything else. And when it's called a malt, that means that it is 100% barley, that they're using nothing else. So single malt means it is a 100% barley product out of one distillery.
All right, so as I said, Aberlour is a Speyside distillery, and whiskeys that come from the Speyside region typically don't have a lot of peat in them. That's the real smoky stuff that, you know, when we had our Lafroig, that really turns some people off from Scotch. This is a much softer kind of whiskey. They're known for being very fruity, and we have 2 of them here. We got these actually by participating in a tasting that the distillery did. They were generous enough to send us 2 samples, one of their 16-year and one of their 18-year. We're going to start with the 16, and Brad, I think we should just go all the way through the 16 and then go ahead and do the 18. So this 16-year was aged and matured in a combination of sherry butts, which are, you know, casks that you age sherry in, and also first fill bourbon casks. So they're used bourbon barrels, but it's the first time that they've had anything put in them after they get shipped over to Scotland. So they still have a lot of that kind of bourbon-y character to them. Brad, what are you picking up here on the nose of the 16-year?
I feel like I'm getting like some kind of like fruity dried raisins. A little bit floral. It almost feels like a rose type of smell to it. And there's a little bit of spice going on there too. So it's a decently enticing aroma. It's not blowing me out of the water. I'll give it a 7.5.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty close there, Brad. And the first note that I took, even before I looked up, like, what is this being aged in, was ex-bourbon barrel, because I did get a little bit of kind of bourbon-y character to this. I don't know if it was more of like the rye jumping out of the glass at me or what, but I definitely picked up on that floral note as well. And for me, the 2 dominant notes here are that sort of very floral, almost rose-like smell and the oak. I'm not blown away by this. I don't think there's a lot of sweetness going on here on the nose. I'm actually only going to give it a 6.5 on the nose.
Yeah, and as I jump into the flavor, I think that this has like a slightly oaky palate, but that it really has a lot of really nice, sweet, fruity notes that kind of remind me of like a nice dark plum. I'm really enjoying the flavor overall. I think I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 on taste.
I do like the flavor here, Brad. It's definitely coming across a little sweeter than it did on the nose, which I like. You guys know that I like some sweetness to my whiskey. It is very grain forward. Like, I definitely get a lot of that barley flavor here. When you go to swallow, though, the very back end of the taste, it's like black coffee for me. Really good, strong black coffee. And then a very small like hint of like a dark cherry, a black cherry kind of finish on this. I like it a lot. I like the fruit on this. Typically, I'd be expecting something like a pear or an apple on a whiskey like this, but having that dark coffee and like dark cherry note, I think really puts this one over the edge for me. I'm going to give it a 7.5 on taste.
Yeah, and that brings us to our finish, which in my mind, it's got like a decently long, pleasantly warm finish. That it's not a strong Kentucky hug or anything, but it just stays nice and warm in your belly, and it brings kind of this oaky fruitiness to bear that you've been kind of experiencing along this entire way. I think it's a solid finish. I'm going to stick it an 8 out of 10 on the finish.
The problem that I'm having with this whiskey, Brad, is that I can tell that it's a well-made whiskey, and I know that it's been aged for 16 years. It's definitely a pricey whiskey, but none of it is really blowing me away. And I don't think that this finish is really sticking out like any more than cheaper scotches that we've had. I don't see much here in terms of like a mind-blowingly good finish. I'm just going to stay at a 7 on finish.
Well, yeah, and that brings us to our balance category, which in my mind, this is like, it's like a solid whiskey. The aroma leads you nicely to the palate. It's a little sweeter on the taste and finish than it is on the smell. But overall, I think it's a fine, well-balanced whiskey. I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10 on the balance.
Yeah, I'll stay at a 7 here again, Brad. Like, it's above average. It's a pleasant drinking experience. I think where I'm really going to ding this is on our value score. And you have the digits pulled up over there, Brad. What are we looking at for a bottle of Aberlour 16 in the state of Ohio?
This baby will set you back $69.99.
Yeah, see, this is where I just can't get on board with this, man. Like, if I give this even a 7, that would put me at 35. Which is where we typically draw the line and say, yes, this is where you should start buying this bottle. I know that they have a cask strength expression, which I'm probably going to butcher the name of, but I believe it's called Abunad, and people really like that. And I would go all in on this at cask strength. At the proof that it's at, and the kind of generally pleasant but not knocking your socks off nature of the whole thing, at $70, I think I'm only going to give this a 4.5 out of 10 on value.
You know, for somebody who doesn't often spend $50+ on any whiskey, I think 70, this is like right on the end of being like, yeah, I might spend that, but just barely. And it's only because I know that the world of Scotch is just bonkers expensive in general. So I would say I'll give it a 5.5 on value. It's not the worst value in Scotch. I think it's a fine whiskey that anybody should try. Once again, try it at your local bar. If you're able to find it, pick up a dram, and I think it's worth trying. But overall, yeah, 5.5. It's not the best value out there.
All right, Brad, so that is bringing me out to a 32.5 out of 50. What are you coming out to?
I'm at a 36.5 out of 50, Bob.
All right, so that's putting us at a 34.5. We are just a hair under that 35 mark that we've just been talking about. Brad, you said that you would recommend trying it at a bar, maybe not buying it. You know, I'm in the same place. We haven't had a ton of Speysides on this podcast. I would gravitate, even though I don't really like peat, I think I would gravitate towards something like a Lafroig Lore over this any day of the week. This just it's very soft, it's very delicate, but for me, underwhelming. And so I'm hoping that when we get into this 18, things are going to kind of kick up a notch. We've both poured it out. Brad, you've been nosing and tasting it already. What do you think of the nose on this Aberlour 18?
Yeah, it's amazing. You'd think that you'd get similar stuff, but this one just feels so much more potent. I feel like I'm getting some hints of floral, but I feel like I'm getting a lot of cherry and like a toasted toffee, like not quite caramely, but it's almost like a nutty toffee type of nose that I'm just really, really enjoying. I think it's an incredible nose that gives me an 8.5 out of 10.
Yeah, Brad, I think you're right. You know, while you were talking, I was trying to look up some characteristics of aging things in first fill bourbon barrels. And they said that just like with bourbon, the danger of over-aging things in first fill bourbon barrels is it could get too oaky on the back end. And that's exactly where I am with this. I do think this definitely has way more oak on the nose, and it does run the risk of being too oaky. There is no more of that floral character we got on the 16. But what's replacing it here is just really great caramel notes that you get from the bourbon barrels, and you know that classic butterscotch nose that you get from a good scotch. It's much darker. It's much sweeter. I like it. I'm going to give it a 7.5 on the nose.
Yeah, Bob, I really think that this is an impressive whiskey that as I get into the palate, oh my gosh, dude, it just has this like dreamy cream-like substance to it that pairs with the oak. There's a bit of a jam-like structure to it that reminds me of like a raspberry jam. It's not overly sweet, but man, this is a really beautiful whiskey that I'm coming out to a 9 out of 10 on for the palate.
Wow, Brad. Yeah, I'm not quite there with you. This one, for me, I'm reading tasting notes from other reviewers online right now, and I'm not getting as much complexity in this as some of you guys are. For me, this definitely leans into that salted caramel, butterscotch, ice cream topping kind of thing. And then on the back end, you get that really great classic malt flavor. There's definitely a little bit more smoke on this one than there was on the 16, like a hint of peat. And it comes across a bit ashy for me. And the finish is a little bit more bitter for me than I would like it to be. But overall, the whole taste is really, really nice. I'm going to stick at a 7.5 with this one.
Well, I feel like for me, you started talking about the finish there. For me, the finish, it almost feels like a creme brulee with just a nice piece of like, I don't know, spicy oak in the middle of it. Like there's all sorts of stuff going on here that I enjoy it. The finish lasts for quite a while. You're reminded of the flavor as you move on from it. I'm going to stick it a 9 out of 10 on the finish.
I will say the nice thing about this is that the finish, it doesn't burn at all going down. It is very, very drinkable. Again, for me, I'm not a fan of peatiness. And so like, I think that I've just primed myself to detect the peat when it's there. It kind of goes bitter for me on the back end of my palate and into the finish. And so, Brad, while you continue to pick up some of these nice sweet and fruity notes, I'm like focusing, I think, maybe too heavily on the kind of ashy notes I'm getting here.
You need to get your head out of your ash, Bob.
Hey, I'm only going to give this a 6.5 on the finish.
Well, and that brings us to balance. And I think that you get a hint of that creaminess at the start, but it really overwhelms you throughout the rest of it. For me, as you move into balance, I think this is a beautifully balanced whiskey. It's not the most complex whiskey that I've ever had, but I would say that it handles some different flavors interacting with one another really, really well. And I'm going to stay at a 9 out of 10.
Wow. Yeah, overall, Brad, I think this is a very well-balanced whiskey. I don't know that I would say that it's better balanced than the 16 was. And I think I'm going to go back to your very first note, which is that this is just a vastly different whiskey than the 16 was. If you like light, if you like floral, if you like some fruit character, go with the 16. If you like dark, caramely, butterscotchy notes with a little bit of smoke, you go with the 18. I think they're both well-balanced. I still don't know, Brad, that I would say that this is a better balanced whiskey than like the Lefroy Gloire that we had last year. I'm going to go with a 7.5 again on the balance.
Yeah, I mean, I think we might be coming out to decently different spots here, Bob, especially because when we come down to value, this fine whiskey with no E is on sale in the most beautiful state of Ohio, for $129.99. So this one, my friend, is going to set you back a pretty penny. I think, man, I struggle with this because I want to give it a low score. You know, this is a really solid, like I would say far above average whiskey that I really, really love. But if you're going into the triple digits, it better be a daggone great whiskey. Mm-hmm. And so I'm kind of jumping back and forth. Do I think this is a great whiskey or not? I think I'm right on the line. And so I think that's why I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 on value. It's a solid value. I think that if you have the money to spend on scotch, this is one well worth purchasing.
Yeah.
But if you're somebody who, you know, like Bob and I, look at a $50 price tag and go, ooh, I don't know if I can pay that, then this is going to be a tough draw for you.
So one of the things that I've been doing while you've been talking, Brad, is just kind of trying to find user reviews of people who like Speyside scotches. And it seems like people think this is one of the best Speyside single malts you can get at this price point. And I just pulled up a list of distilleries in Speyside, and I'm realizing that I think I just don't like Speyside whiskeys generally, because here's some of the, I don't know how many of these you might have tried, Brad, on your own, but Aberlour, Balvenie, Ben Romack, Cardew, Glenfarclas, Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, Macallan. These are all Speyside distilleries, and I've had quite a few of these, and especially like with the Glenlivet, I think that might be the most popular one out of this whole area. They're definitely like really light, easy to drink. You know, people in America use them for mixers kind of a thing. And so a really well-made version of that is something that I just don't know if I have like the nuanced palate to pick out what's a really good version of that. Because to me, again, this just tastes like a more expensive version of Glenlivet. And there's no way that I would ever spend $130 on that.
Dude, I'm not gonna lie though. Glenlivet double oaked,
it's fine.
Oh,
it's
dude,
fine.
I think that's pretty solid, especially for the price that you're paying compared to other scotches.
Right.
I feel like double oaked is pretty good.
Okay, so here you go. Glenlivet double oaked is 10-year or 12-year?
12-year.
12-year. There's a 12-year whiskey that you can get for $45. Now again, this is 18-year. I understand, like it's going to be way more expensive. I just don't see this as being $100 better than Glenlivet. So for me, you know, I'm sure that if we have any listeners in Scotland right now, they are like just cursing me out. I don't see the increase in price as being merited. I'm only going to give this, Brad, a 4 out of 10 on value.
I don't think that's totally unfair. Like I said, I think it's a really solid whiskey that I would maybe buy once in my life and just enjoy for a year or so and you know, call it a day. But I can 100% understand why somebody would say, ooh, $130? No, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, it comes down to, do you really want to try a solid scotch that, once again, we said it for the 16. If you're able to get this at your local whiskey bar, go for it. I really think it'd be worth picking up and trying. But in the end, Bob, I'm coming out to a 42.5 out of 50. I think very highly of this whiskey.
Wow, Brad, we are way off on this one.
I told you, man, we're going to be vastly different here.
I am at a 33 out of 50, which means that we are coming out to a 75.5 out of 100 or a 37.75 out of 50. That's over the line into the try it or buy it category. I'm not going to recommend buying it. I would recommend trying it. I think people should try more scotches in general. I think it really helps to develop and hone your palate in terms of like identifying what region it's from, what region you like best. This is just not my general cup of tea.
Now, I will say, Bob, I was just looking at our listenership, and the United Kingdom makes up 2% of the total film and whiskey listens, and Scotland makes up 4% of that 2%. So for those three listeners, we apologize.
I was going to say, now it makes up 0% of our listenership because they've clearly
100%.
turned this off. Yeah. All right, Brad. I've really enjoyed this. Again, we want to say thank you to Aberlour for allowing us to participate in this tasting, for expanding our portfolio and our palates here. Brad, let's get back into talking about Schindler's List.
Let's get to it. Well, that was Aberlour's 16-year and 18-year whiskeys, both of which I think Bob and I would say are really solid whiskeys.
For sure.
It's once again, it's Scotch, man. That price point is going to kill you every time.
Although, Brad, I don't know if you saw, but they literally just ended the tariffs of stuff coming from Scotland. So there was something, I think it had to do with like airlines for a while, and the UK levied like retaliatory tariffs against everything coming into the US. They said that it's ending and that within like 6 months, the US will see like an up to 25% decrease in the price of Scotch over here.
Bro, let's go, man, because I really love Scotch. Honestly, one of the notes that I took when I was tasting the 16 was that it's a really solid whiskey that just reignited my passion for Scotch. Because like we haven't had Scotch on here in a while, and man, oh man, do I miss it. So I was really happy that we had this on here this week. Well, and I'm glad that we, got back into the world of Scotch as we're telling this story that, occurred within Europe, that we're drinking a European whiskey.
Absolutely.
So it seems like a good pairing.
For sure. And Brad, as we get into the more analysis-based part of the episode, I know that as soon as I walked in your house today, you were like, hey, have you seen this YouTube video about Schindler's List? So I know you wanted to talk a little bit and plug this YouTube channel.
Yeah, so there's this channel out there called Cinema Therapy, and I genuinely think it's one of the best movie analysis channels out there. But they talk about Schindler's List, and they frame it in the sense that you see these two men. You see Schindler and you see Goethe, and you see both of them have opportunities to grow in compassion. And continually throughout this film, you see Goethe choose compassion just like slightly, get bored with it, and go back to being capricious and just flat out evil. And the difference is that Schindler, who starts off as, we talked about him being like a womanizer, he is a slave laborer. Like he flat out says, did you hear what they said about Poles? And Kingsley talks about this or that. And he goes, no. Poles cost more, Jews cost less. I want to make more money, so hire the Jews. So he starts off as a pretty evil man looking to profit off of the backs of slaves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no other way to put it. And so with that being said, you see him have these opportunities to choose compassion, to choose to see the Jewish person as what I just called them, as people. Throughout the film, there's that moment where a woman comes into his office and says, hey, like, I've been hiding under this fake name, but my parents are the Perlmans, and you need, I'm just asking you, I'm begging you to save them. Like, and he goes into Stern's office and he's angry and he goes, people die. I'm not a charity. I can't just save everyone.
You think I don't know what you're doing? You're so quiet all the time. I know.
Are you losing money?
No, I'm not losing money. That's not the point.
That's not the point.
It's dangerous. It's dangerous to me.
But then what does he do? He says, hey, take my watch and use it to bribe them into sending me these two parents. Mm-hmm. And so he chooses compassion, and you see that those little choices slowly change him throughout the film to the point where we see him in that final scene devastated that he wasn't able to save more. And so I think what they pointed out was that the power of human choice, we as humans, especially in America, we think that our choices have no effect on our souls, that we just go day by day buying the things that we buy and watching the media that we watch and engaging with the people we engage with. And we think it doesn't affect our souls at all. And it couldn't be more utterly wrong. Like, the actions we take on a day-to-day basis transform us into better or worse people. And I think that this movie really hones in on that in a beautiful way.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I wasn't even thinking about this when you started, but I think one of the scenes that best illustrates that is a scene that I think is kind of left up to interpretation. And it's where Schindler's having his birthday party, and two people from the camp come in, and it's an older girl, like a young woman and a young girl. And he kisses both of them and eventually gets sent to jail for it, has to get bailed out. It gets him in really hot water with the Nazis that he would dare to kiss a Jew because, Amon Gert even says at one point to his maid, I know you're not really technically a person. The Third Reich sees them as not fully people, and he chooses to kiss them. And the way I interpreted that scene was just basically his FU to all of the Nazis around him. And it was a really dumb thing to do, and it was not strategic, and it landed him in jail and got him scrutinized. But it was his way of basically saying, I am so fed up with this that I am going to force everyone in attendance to be uncomfortable and to acknowledge that this person that I am bestowing a kiss upon is a person.
Well, and the beautiful thing about that scene is that they show Schindler kissing all of these other women, right? Because it's his birthday, and you just have to make out with this random dude who's it's his birthday, and he's powerful and has money, so you have to do it. And then he kisses the Jewish girl in the same way that he kisses all these other women, with all this like passion and vigor. And I think that, and she is obviously horrified. She's like, this is inappropriate. I don't want to kiss this man. We just wanted to bring him a cake.
Which, again, clearly, we're not condoning that behavior.
No, not at all. But I think the interesting thing is, what you see in that moment is that Schindler is trying to show the rest of them what you just said, Bob, that these Jewish people are humans, and that it doesn't matter if it's a Jewish woman or a German woman. If I'm going to kiss them for my birthday, I'm going to kiss them for my birthday. And once again, probably not something good, probably something they did back in the day that gladly we've moved on from. But in that moment, I think it's such a powerful testament to what Schindler was trying to embody, and he had learned throughout the course of the film.
So this movie comes out in 1993, unanimous critical praise. It really establishes Spielberg, like I said before, as a master filmmaker in the eyes of his fellow filmmakers. And even if you just look at something as simple as the Wikipedia page on this movie, you have quotes from people like Billy Wilder, who wrote him just a glowing, letter, and Roman Polanski, who doesn't really deserve to be talked about on this show, but Polanski passed on directing this at first and then said that he could not have done it as well as Spielberg because he could not have stayed as objective about it as Spielberg did. And I really noted that word objective because clearly it's not objective. Like, he's not putting everything on equal moral footing. Like, what's wrong is wrong. But I really appreciated that somebody noticed the kind of, I guess the word would be like dispassionate nature of just how coldly and how easily they could shoot someone in the head. And then the camera just kind of moves on about its merry way. And I really appreciated that was noted. It did make me wonder, though, Brad, because we talked about how this movie shares so much in common with Saving Private Ryan in terms of the filmmaking technique, that people can see this movie for what it is, as a very objective look at the horrors of the Holocaust. But when it came to Saving Private Ryan, if you remember, the big criticism there was that people did not see that movie as objective. They viewed it as kind of like a rah-rah, like America First kind of movie. And that was always my big gripe with the criticism of Saving Private Ryan, was like, this is clearly not what Spielberg's doing. He is portraying everything the way it happened and allowing you to draw your own conclusions about it. I just thought it was interesting that with this movie, no one ever accused it of like, oh, this is actually a pro-Nazi movie because he doesn't condemn the Nazis outright. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's really interesting to see how the two movies are so similar and yet treated so differently.
Yeah, and I think that the key here is something that Ebert really keyed in on in his review of the film back in 1993. And literally in the last paragraph of his review, he quotes someone who is actually critiquing the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. And he simply says, "Does one have to make observations about slavery? Depict it. That's enough." And Ebert basically goes on to say, like, that's what Spielberg does here. You don't need to make an observation. Oh, by the way, the Holocaust was evil. Like, it's so obviously evil and terrible that all you need to do is show what happened, and the natural human will recoil in horror at the travesty that it is. And I think that, for me, is the best way to describe Spielberg in this movie. He's not an active filmmaker in this movie. He is not actively trying to tell you, by the way, the Holocaust is bad, the Holocaust is bad, the Holocaust is bad. Like, even with Gert, he gives him some redeeming moments where he has opportunities to be a better person. You know, and obviously he chooses poorly. But in the end, he is not an actively, let's make everybody realize how bad the Holocaust is. He just simply shows it. And I think that's why this movie has so much staying power.
Yeah. And I think that's a perfect way to get into our final scores here, Brad. I'd love to hear what you think of this movie. I think we both acknowledge that it is flawed. And again, this is one of those movies that I think it was number 6 or something like that on AFI's 100 Best Movies list. And I say this as carefully as possible. You almost unthinkingly put it at the top of the heap because it's such an important film. It is a monumental work of art. I acknowledge that. But I never hear anybody talk about the fact that this movie is a very flawed film. And I think it comes out a lot when people do their lists of like best Spielberg movies, even movie critics. I never see Schindler's List at the top of those lists. I think if we're all being honest, most of us have another either favorite Spielberg movie or movie that we think is just actually objectively better than Schindler's List. It can be, in my opinion, a great movie and an important movie without us having to anoint it as a perfect movie. So I don't know. React to that. Give me your final score.
Honestly, Bob, I think that if I just scored this purely based on, you know, the cinematography, the music, the everything going on here, the acting, I think that this movie is a 9.5 out of 10. But I think that I'm still going to give it a 10 out of 10. You know, we've said before that a 10 out of 10 doesn't mean a movie is perfect. And I think that this movie, it's just simply too important for me to not give a 10 out of 10. I don't think anybody's bad if they don't give it a 10 out of 10. I honestly would probably agree with the take to a certain level. But I just find it to be too important and too honest about one of the worst moments in human history to not give a 10 out of 10.
Yeah, I mean, and I totally get that view. And I'm glad you see where I'm coming from as well, because I am going to give this movie a 9.5 out of 10. And I think, honestly, I probably would not have done this if we hadn't just watched Saving Private Ryan like less than a year ago. And that's a movie that is just constantly shit on by critics who just continually, I think, misread that film. And watching it this time, I was like, they are overlooking, I think, Spielberg's best directorial work ever to just shit on this movie. And watching Schindler's List, I think that it has so much DNA in common with Saving Private Ryan and is honestly less sentimental, less, more bleak the kind of things that you think critics would like more. But watching it this time, I was like, man, there are just some really big glaring issues with this script that I can't get over. I do think that, like, towards the end of the film, continuing to cut back to Schindler really took away some of that dramatic power. I'm going to give it a 9.5. I'm comfortable giving it a 9.5, and that puts us out to a 9.75 out of 10. This is the kind of movie that I can see everyone's argument for why it should be a 10 out of 10. And I completely agree with it. Like, I agree with what you're saying, Brad. This is one of the most important films ever made. It's a movie that everybody needs to watch. And at the same time, I think it's okay to acknowledge that it could have been tightened up a little bit as a movie and maybe come out a little bit better than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, an over 3 hour runtime, any movie that goes over 3 hours, I think it's okay to say, did it need to be that long? Mm-hmm. And it's okay to do that with this movie as well. But honestly, in the end, we really want to know what you think. We haven't delved into a ton of heavy movies on this podcast. And so, where are you guys at? What's going on in your brains? Let us know. You can find us on social medias at Film Whiskey on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, really anywhere you want to talk about stuff.
I just love that you asked our listeners, what's going on in your brains?
What's going on, man? What's going on in that headspace?
Oh, man.
Talk to me, bro.
You can also leave us a voicemail. We'd love to play some of your listener voicemails on the air. Let us know your thoughts on Schindler's List. Let us know your thoughts on the whiskeys we've been trying. You can leave us a voicemail on our anchor.fm webpage, which is anchor.fm/filmwhiskey.
Next week, we'll be back continuing our Best Picture run. We'll be talking about the 1950 classic All About Eve, which, Bob, it's a pretty hard left turn.
It really is. And I'm excited for it, Brad. So we'll see you next week for All About Eve. Until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.